to the stage Ayesha Sultan.
Assalamu alaikum. How is everybody? After having a little bit of a break, I hope we can come back refreshed and everything. So let me start first of all by saying thank you so much for the invitation today, for the organizers. And it's really a pleasure and a privilege for me to be here with you today. Also, congratulations in advance for the Emirati Women's Day on Monday. It's really a great occasion to celebrate women at any point in time. So today what I've done is I've put a presentation together to talk about embracing equity. Oh, sorry, it's gone. Embracing equity. And thank you again for the lovely introduction. My name is Ayesha Sultan Junaidi. Just a little bit of background on myself. I'm a 20-plus year professional. I started my career off in London, working in management consultancy, and in Paris. I came back to Dubai and joined a very small company who had 6 ports and had an ambition with His Highness Sheikh Mohammed's vision to grow Dubai, and ended up going on massive acquisition sprees and IPOs, creating a company called DP World, one of the top 4 port operators in the world. I worked with them for 12 years. I had the privilege of working with the Expo 2020 team as part of the bid team. I speak French, so that was always very helpful when we were doing all the bids, which were all in French. And I was lucky to be part of the committee with the higher elements of government in France in 2013 when it was announced that Dubai had won the bid for Expo 2020, one of the highlights of my career. I then moved on to TCOM. I was CEO there for a little while, and then I worked with Dubai Holding, and then I moved to work with a British FTSE 250 company called Circa Middle East, which does government outsourcing, air traffic control, and that kind of thing. Interesting, we spoke a little bit about women earlier in changing careers, and during COVID I actually took a little bit of a break and decided to pursue something that I was very interested in, which was law, and I did a master's in law, and I am now focused on educating myself more in dispute resolution, so arbitration and mediation, mainly because that was a lot of the work that I did when we did mergers and acquisitions. I've been on boards for about 11 years now, and I'm a fellow and chartered director from the Institute of Directors in the UK. I also sit on the board of the GCC Board of Directors Institute in Dubai. And I'm a big proponent of women getting educated in corporate governance. And so today what I've done is I've put together a presentation about women on boards. And I just want to start really by talking about some of the challenges that boards face. They really are immense. You know, from the pandemic, we saw how boards had to very quickly adapt to climate change, to artificial intelligence, to digital transformation. And so what I've put today for you is a slide from the Global Network of Director Institutes, which is an organization of 24 institutes around the world, around 150,000 directors of companies who shared their thoughts about what are the things that are critical in the immediate, the next 3 to 5 years, and then 2030 plus. What are the things that are on their minds? And interesting to see from here is that for boards, the most important thing right now is the need for long-term robust strategy in an environment that's dominated by short-term pressures, such as the pandemic and the need to quickly grasp that, such as digital. What is also interesting is to note that there's nothing here about diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I just thought that was a very important point to actually point out, because while we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, I got my first opportunity to be on boards in 2012 with TCOM. I was an independent board member. I was chairman of the Audit and Risk Committee, and I was vice chairman of their HR committee. But I got that opportunity because they were looking for Emirati women to put on boards. And that's how I got started. And I think when you come to crises, what tends to happen is initiatives like Women on Boards get put aside, because while they're important, there's a more dying pressure right now dealing with the pandemic, dealing with something that's going to cause issues in the long term to the financial elements of the business. Interesting, though, also to see is the next slide really talks about the next 3 to 5 years, and you have 2 charts here. The first one really talks about the key challenges required to board norms, and you can see that one of them is including equity and diversity. Then the other chart also talks about practices that are going to be less acceptable in the next 3 to 5 years. And again, number one is the lack of board diversity. So it's interesting to see that board directors do believe that in the next 3 to 5 years, it's actually going to be unacceptable not to have women, not to have different types of nationalities, different ages on boards. And again, if we go a little bit further in 2030, what we see is it's still there. More diverse is number 4 on the list. But, again, it's still back up there. Now, why is it important? Let me start by saying COVID was a very good lesson. What it did is it was a catalyst to bring up some of the major issues. And one of the major issues it did was it talked about how important technology was and the integration of technology. I sit today on the board of Alliance Française. It's a French institute around the world that teaches French language. And one of the major things that happened to us in Alliance Française during COVID was we lost all of our business. So our business model collapsed. Why? Because we weren't really digital. Our business models, people coming into the Alliance to be taught. Now the people weren't coming in, so we had to very, very quickly go online. We had to learn. We had this massive learning curve about the importance of digitalization. The other thing that also happened during COVID was that diverse and inclusive boards actually performed better. And it also pointed out how boards needed to be present and how board members needed to perhaps be fewer on the boards because they needed to focus on the companies that they were on, but also that they had to upskill. So really the emphasis on becoming more technically competent. In fact, companies on the S&P 500 found that age and diversity among directors correlated with better financial performance during the COVID-19 pandemic. So let's start by asking the question, why does it matter? Why does diversity, equity, inclusion actually matter? It matters because the composition of the board is absolutely crucial in its effectiveness. Why? Because we live in a diverse world. We're selling to diverse audiences. If you have a more diverse board, you have better governance, you have better oversight, you have more and different viewpoints being considered. It also brings up more innovation. They're finding that performance increases in every single measure, including financial. You get more real view of your customer. And then therefore what it does, it allows for better decisions overall. What does that do? It makes the organization more resilient. And so when you have these crises, when you have these attacks on the organization, when your company is more resilient, you're able to survive and you're able to succeed in that kind of environment. And I think it's very telling that in 2020, the Goldman Sachs CEO, David Solomon, actually stated that the investment bank would not be taking companies public unless they had at least one diverse board member with an emphasis on women. And the quote was, all male, all white boards are actually considered red flags for biases. And the fact that we're actually talking about these kind of things now is leaps and bounds from where we were, say, 10 years ago. I want to focus a little bit now on statistics. And for this, I've used a couple of different reports, the main one being a report that Aurora 50, one of the entities that is pushing women to be on boards, did in June 2022. And it's interesting to see that in 2020, the number of women in the UAE on boards was around 3.5%. In 21, ESCA, which is the Securities and Commodities Authority, came out with a directive, which was that all listed companies had to put at least one woman on board. And so what happened was that by June 2022, that number jumped to 8.9%. Now again, let's put it into perspective, that's only 77 seats out of the 868 seats that are available on the 115 companies that are listed on the ADX and the DFM. So that's locally. If we look regionally, it's probably around the same. Now, the percentages I have here, this is a Deloitte report from 2021, where it says the percentage of women on boards in Saudi is around 1.7%. I would think that might have gone up given the events that have changed in the last couple of years in Saudi. Qatar is around 1.2%, but in general, in our region, which if you call it the MENAT region, the Middle East, North Africa, and Turkey, this is the latest statistic that I've been able to get, it's around 8.6%. If we look globally then, how does it rank? And what I've done here is I've taken the European Women on Board Gender Diversity Index. They have this index on their website. They generally do it every couple of years. And the country leading today in Europe, and Europe is by far the most advanced continent, if you like, for women on board, is France. But it's also very interesting to understand some of the other statistics. So Deloitte do their report every 2 years. And the number of women globally on board seats has increased by 2.8% in the 2 years. So today it stands at 19.7%. And what Deloitte talk about is they say parity, which means being equal, will not be reached at this rate until 2045. Interesting, in November 2022, there was a landmark step taken by the European Union, and they passed a law called Women on Board Directives. What that law says is that publicly traded companies now have to have 40% of non-executive director posts or 1/3 of the director posts filled by women by July 2026, and if not, there will be sanctions against those countries. Now, what is interesting is that it's taken 10 years. This directive was actually started in 2012, and it took them 10 years in the European Union for the Parliament to actually believe that this was important enough to actually legislate and make it become law. So PwC have done many surveys on them. One of the surveys that I found interesting was they came out with a figure saying 66% of women believe that governments actually have to intervene in the private sector to set targets for gender diversity. And I find that interesting because we have this debate about quotas a lot. I actually spoke, I think it was in May at the Capital Club, about should we have quotas, yes or no? And I was actually asked to be on the no side. And it was a very interesting debate, and it was very interesting to see that the line between the for and the against is actually very, very thin. So if we have just a little look about advantages and disadvantages of quotas, you've got the normal points about why would you have quotas? Well, it will increase women's representations on the board. It will create a level playing field. It will bring diverse perspectives for decision-making because now you're forcing the women to be there and to speak. It will encourage cultural change. And it's been proven to be successful in other countries. But there are also points against it. And these are very, very valid points. As women, we talk about having a meritocratic system. We want to be seen as being as competent in our work as a male colleague. So having quotas does go a little bit of a way to undermine that merit-based system. You also, as a woman, you don't want to be a token. You don't want to be a tick box exercise. You're there on the board because you met, you're a female, so therefore you got a tick. It can create resentment and bias from the men towards the women. And it can also be circumvented. So there are ways, of course, companies can move around that. So these are just some of the points. And it's also interesting if we look at countries, how they've actually gone about, their setting and getting more women on boards. So the European Women on Boards, what they talk about is they say if you don't set an objective, you won't be able to measure it, and then you won't be able to see the progress, and you won't be able to eventually get the parity. And regulation and intention is important, but you have to adapt it to the culture and the country. So interesting to note that France, which was at 45%, only actually started getting to that target when a directive was put down. Basically, board members would not be paid in France or in Belgium if they didn't meet the women on board quota. So then, the quota in France was 40%. Today, the figure is at 45%. In Belgium, the target was 33%. Today, the figure is 37%. Norway, which is today at 41%, was very interesting. They actually made it law in 2003 to have 40% female quota. But they allowed companies 5 years to self-regulate. They didn't do it. So in 2008, they put new sanctions on these companies, and today, Norway is at 41%. But it's interesting to see that not every country did that. The UK, Sweden, Finland, they didn't want directives. They had softer measures. They don't like these top-down directives and sanctions. They prefer guidelines. What is funny, I think, though, is in the UK, they have no sanctions, but they have a name and shame campaign. So they know, it's very publicly known, the companies that are good and that are pushing women forward and the companies that are not good. And so it pushes those companies that are not good to want to be more in the pool, in the club of those companies that are good. Having said all of this, it is still very difficult for women to get on board positions. It's a struggle, whether in the UAE, whether anywhere around the world. It is difficult to find for women to find board positions. And Aurora did a really good job in talking about what are some of the barriers that women have in terms of getting board positions. I also wrote an article during COVID times in 2020 about championing women leaders and building resilience. And some of the examples of why women struggle to get on board are things like limited networking, lack of support from the organization, lack of champions to nominate them and push them forward, an unclear path. This balance between domestic and work life. This anytime, anywhere model. So can you come at 10 o'clock at night to the golf club to meet the client? No, it's harder for a woman to say yes than a man to kind of do those things. And there are many also stereotypes as well that need to be changed. But what is absolutely key and what is very, very well known is that 60% of board positions are nominated through networks. And so networking, not only is it vital, but it is not easy, especially for women. That's why these conferences and meeting people through these type of forums are very, very important. It's the mejlis sessions that women don't get invited to that have to create their own ways of networking. It's the golf days that women don't go to and don't create their own spa days, as a kind of compensation. But it's actually not only about boards, it's actually about creating a pipeline of women who are capable of taking those board positions all the way through the different levels of the company. So we've talked a little bit about the issue, we've talked about the statistics, we've talked about what different countries have done, and we've talked about the barriers. So now let's talk a little bit about how can we support women to get onto boards. And what actually is needed is this full integrated ecosystem, one that includes direction setting, one that includes training, one that includes mentorship programs, a supportive system, policies, regulation, quotas if need be, depending on the culture. And just some examples of what this looks like in companies that have done it well. The first is that the tone from the top has to be one that promotes diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it also has to link it to the strategies, the KPIs, communicate it, and the reward system. If your bonus is going to be targeted by KPIs that you're not achieving, you're going to listen up a little bit more as to what those KPIs are going to be. We've got to make parity the goal. So it's not just a case of having women on the board tick. It's about having women and men be on equal footing to be able to contribute on the board. It's not only about them getting a seat at the table, it's actually about creating the environment where the woman's voice is actually heard and valued. We actually have to train more female board members. And as I said, I sit today on a board of GCC BDI. Our key aim is to train people in corporate governance. There are so many different entities here that do it, whether it's GCC BDI, Aurora, Haukama. There are institutes abroad that also train. So my first thing I would always say is go and learn what being a board member is about. What is your role? What is not your role? It's about engaging in targeted recruitment. So it's not only, as I said, about developing the board. It's about developing the people underneath the board. It's about starting at the bottom level and building women up to be managers, to then be senior managers. It's all along the pipeline. It's about providing voluntary opportunities for diversity training. Also about having company-led initiatives that are supportive. So, for example, McKinsey's, if a woman is pregnant, what they do is they have a policy to limit the travel, because a lot of consultancy work is traveling. They have a policy to limit travel for new mothers. It's about appointing a diversity manager. It's about signaling that these things are important to the organization, having the sponsor and champion program. When I first started in my career in London in consultancy, I was given a buddy. So somebody who was maybe a year or two older than me that I could ask embarrassing questions like, where's the bathroom, what do I do if he shouts at me, etc. And I was given a mentor, somebody a few ranks above me, who I could go to and get direction, how am I doing in my first year? These programs need to be more actively, and for me as a newcomer into the business world, this was essential. It's about creating diverse selection panels. So when you come in for an interview, you're not surrounded by only men. I laugh because when I went for my charter director in the UK, it's a 3-year program where the last level of being a charter director, you have to be accepted by the panel that believe you've done enough work. And at that point in time, I was sitting on a board in the UK, which was all men and me, I think 7 men and myself. I was on the board of TCOM, which was 3 ladies and 2 men. And I was being interviewed by a panel of all men in the UK who asked me, I know the UAE governance is probably not at the same level as the UK governance. What is one of the differences you see? And so my answer to them was, well, actually, I find that the policies in the UAE to push women on boards are stronger. Because in the UAE, I'm sitting on a board with 3 women and 2 men. And in the UK, I'm sitting on a board with 6 men and 1 woman, who is myself. So we have to push against those barriers. But it's also about holding people accountable. And it's interesting because it's only when people believe that what they're doing is being measured or being seen that they actually pay more attention to it. It's when it becomes part of their compensation and rewards that it becomes important. We've got to capture, we've got to publish the numbers. So they may be small, but at least if we know where we're starting from, we know what the bottlenecks are and we can then move forward. And we also have to bring men on the journey. I know we mentioned this a couple of times today, but it really isn't about them and us. It's about we. It's about how do we get a supportive system. In my career, I've mainly been supported by men. Actually, I've had women who've stopped me in my tracks and not been as supportive. But, you know, it is always about us together. How do we make the platform better? Because by women improving, men improve, the company improves. And it's also that men are actually in a unique position to help push women. So if you see women that are getting ready to be in board positions, put them on nonprofit organizations, on subsidiary organizations, let them get some experience, because in a couple of years, they're going to be ready to then take on the bigger positions. Then there's also government initiatives, and we're blessed in this country. We have all the government support that we need, and quotas. And I just finally want to end by talking about, what can we as women do to champion ourselves? You know, we have a responsibility to develop ourselves. And I think somebody today talked to me about, are you an entrepreneur? I think all women are actually entrepreneurs of their own career. We actually manage our own career. Yes, there are a number of things outside our remit. There are a number of things we can't control. But where we can, we need to be as ready as possible. So my advice to somebody that wants to be on the board, Aurora, in their report in June 22, talks about 10 to 15 years to become board ready. I think you can probably do it in about 7 to 10 years, but you need to be technically competent. You need to know your job. You need to know your industry. You need to network. You need to start branding yourself as a board member. You need to get trained. You need to understand what is your role. I myself went and got educated in being a board member. Why? Because I was learning just by seeing people. And I got scared when I got a note from an authority in the UK saying that the company I was sitting on as a board member was in breach of something. And that really scared me, because at that point I didn't know what was my responsibility and what wasn't my responsibility. And you will find that the line between what the board is responsible for and what the management is responsible for is it's very important to know what that is, because the management will always try and push decisions to the board, and it's for the board to have oversight, not to be making the operational decisions in the company. And that line has to be very, very well understood. But just to give you some examples of other things in my career that I find beneficial, you know, really go out and try and get experience wherever you can. You've got to enjoy what you do. If you're not enjoying it, don't do it. And you've got to move beyond your comfort zone. This was something that I was told when I started my career, that if you're not a little bit uncomfortable in your job, you're actually not learning. And we tend to stick to things that we're comfortable with and keep doing it and keep doing it and keep doing that, which is fine, but it also means that you're not developing yourself and you're not growing. Know your role. As I said, go and invest in, if you want to be on board, go and invest in terms of corporate governance, what your role is and what you should do and what you shouldn't be doing. And develop strong networks and support systems. Get mentors, get champions, men and women, and support other women, because it's only by us supporting each other are we actually going to be able to grow. And again, I think this was a point that was mentioned earlier. We've got to make sure that we stay flexible and we balance our careers and family life. I'll just end here by saying thank you. This was the article that I wrote back in 2020. If anybody's interested, that's the link. It's on LinkedIn. This is the QR code for my LinkedIn. And thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.